Gab, you can do what you need to do. Kevin, just keep it to a minute.
Yeah, these are my friends there.
Go for it.
I've got your camera, so they can't see you.
That's good.
Okay, so continuing with the theme of davening, and it says here, mitzvah to daven. Tefillah is one of the mitzvahs according to the Rambam, and it says one who lengthens his prayer will merit a long life. Now, the three Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv were introduced by the I don't use the word modern day sages. When the sacrifices ended, when the temple was destroyed, the sacrifices ended, and so the prayers are actually replacements or substitutes for the daily sacrifices at the different times, which is morning shachris, mincha in the afternoon, mariv in the evening. I don't know if there was in mariv. I don't know if there was at night time. So I think when Yaakov was when he lay down on the Temple Mount, he actually prayed mariv, and that's where it comes from. But the others are to replace the sacrifices that took place during temple times. So anything else to add? Damon, how much time do I have here? How much more time?
All right, just put a minute. Well, we're ready, actually.
Okay, and just one more thing. And it says eating. So eating is an interesting one. Some people won't eat until they've davened. And on Shabbos, which all of us are probably more familiar with, eating, some people will eat something before davening, but some people, ideally one should only wait till Kiddush. And after the Kiddush, some people make a Kiddush in the morning before shul and then have something, but some people eat. It depends on your minhag. I think the Sephardim have a Kiddush before davening, compared to the Ashkenazim. Anyway, okay.
Well done, Betty. All right, so let's get started. So we learned an alternative answer. We're not doing revision. I'm just saying where we left off last time so we can carry on. So if you prefer to say, guys, Rav's Mishnah text read the same as ours, right? Because what did we learn? That Rav reversed the opinions in the Mishnah so that the Mishnah actually conforms with the Brisa. So we say, how does that work? Because the Mishnah trumps the Brisa always. So when he doesn't reverse it, is that if there's one Mishnah and one Brisa, then the Mishnah rules, right? But when there are two Brisas, he reverses the text found in the Mishnah, because two Brisas trumps a Mishnah. Okay, that's the bottom line. So we learned the first Brisa. So as far as the restitution that a robber makes, but the second Brisa is what we touched on the other day. So it was taught in a different Brisa. If one exchanges a cow for a donkey, and the cow gave birth, and similarly, if one sells his Canaanite slave woman and she gives birth. Okay. So what are we actually talking about? So we're saying that this one says she gave birth in my domain, and so the offspring is mine. And that one is silent because he doesn't know. So basically, the one who states his claim of certainty takes possession of the offspring. But what are we actually talking about here? So there are two different cases. There's one of where one sells his Canaanite slave woman and she gives birth. But the primary case we're talking about now, and we touched on the other day, was a case of not the selling of a cow or selling of a donkey, but an exchange of both animals. So bottom line is, if you have a look at it, like Reuven owns a cow, right, guys? And Shimon owns a donkey, and they agree to exchange their animals. So that can be accomplished through a method of acquisition known as chalifin. So chalifin is basically an exchange or barter. So it's in Kedushin 28a and b. And when you actually implement the barter method, and it's agreed that one object is to be exchanged for another, the physical transfer of one object, only one of them, suffices to complete the transaction legally. And the second object is then automatically acquired by its new owner as well. So it follows that the second object needn't be present when the kinyan is performed. So what happens is there's an act of mashicha where you draw the animal towards yourself. Okay? So it can bring certain uncertainties. Now, Kevin, you would laugh at that. I did that on purpose. Certain uncertainties. So what we actually mean here is, look, they can get complicated. Why? Because what happens if with the act of Mashiach, the transferred ownership of the donkey to Reuven and the cow to Shimon, where Shimon gains ownership of the cow, but the cow was located elsewhere at the time. So later it's discovered that the cow had given birth around the time of Chalifin, the exchange, but it's unclear whether the birth occurred before the exchange took place, in which case, guys, the calf would belong to Reuven, because Reuven switched his cow for Shimon's donkey. Okay? And Reuven still owned the cow at the time it gave birth. So we're not sure whether it belongs to Reuven or with the birth occurring only after the transfer occurred, in which case the calf would belong to Shimon, who already acquired the cow at the time that it gave birth. So that's Rashi's complication of what could occur. Now, as far as the Canaanite slave or slave woman is concerned, that's not a case of bartering. That's a case of acquiring them it's called a kinyan kesef. So you just pay money. That's all it is. It's in Kedushin 22b. So it's possible to purchase a slave without the slave being present at the transaction, according to Rashi. So in the case of this price, the buyer basically paid the seller for the slave woman, but she was actually physically located elsewhere and in the process of giving birth. Okay, now it's not a case where you have to have Mashiach or draw the slave woman near you. In other words, as far as a barter is concerned, one of the animals to exchange it apart from money, because there's no money, is to have Mashiach drawing in of the animal. When you're dealing with the transaction of buying a slave, Canaanite slave or slave woman, it's just a transfer of money. You don't have to actually do necessarily an acquisition on this physical slave being with you. There is a way to do an acquisition on the slave, but I don't know if there's still money owing on the slave, etc. But we're saying either way the same argument occurs, because if the slave woman doesn't have to be there and she's located elsewhere, she gave birth at the time the transaction was taking place. So we want to know exactly when did she give birth. Did it occur when the buyer paid the seller for the slave woman and afterwards she gave birth, so that the child belongs to if it occurred afterwards, it belongs to the buyer? Or did it occur before where it actually belongs to the seller because the transaction hadn't taken place yet? Okay, so it's different. Why? Because with respect to a cow, the brisa has to use the example of where the cow was acquired through barter instead of a simple straight sale used in the case of a slave woman. You want to know why, guys? Because with respect to a cow, the situation of doubtful ownership can only arise in a case of barter, not in the case of a sale. Why? Because in the case of a sale, you've got those two animals next to each other. In the case of a sale, you would have the actual animal in question of when you transfer the money in front of you. So you could see if it was going to give birth before and after. In a case of barter, only the one animal has to be with you and the other one is transferred through the implicit agreement of swap. Do you get what I'm saying? So the other animal doesn't have to be with you, which means something could happen to the other animal. I mean, let's not even take a case of giving birth. What happens if you swapped your donkey for a cow and that donkey was hit by a truck? Do you acquire a dead donkey, or is the sale null and void because it was hit by a truck before the barter system or the exchange took place? But it's different in a case of slaves because they can be acquired through the mere payment of money, and it doesn't require the presence of the slaves themselves to be there. Animals aren't acquired through the mere payment of money, through a kinyan kesef, but through a kinyan mashicha, which is a drawing near, because the buyer's actual drawing near of the animal into his possession is part of the acquisition process. So in the case of a sale, it would be very clear whether or not the cow had given birth at the time that the buyer pulled the animal towards him. If I'm giving you my donkey and say, I want your cow, then I don't know where the cow is at the time. The very fact that I say, can we do a swap, and I give one of you guys the donkey, it's implicit that you're going to give me the cow. The question is, when did the cow give birth? Does it belong to the seller or does it belong to the buyer? And it depends when it took place. So that's the two different examples. So this one says she gives birth in my domain, and so the offspring is mine. And that one is silent because honestly, it doesn't know. So what happens in a case where it doesn't know? If one of the parties of the sale, or in this case, the barter, claims that the offspring is definitely his. In other words, he says he knows with certainty that the birth occurred when he was the legal owner of the mother. And the other party is not so sure, it's saying it could be, it couldn't be. That level of confidence actually gets the acquisition. And somebody that's not sure can't offer definitive counterclaim because you have to have a case where both the litigants are certain. If one acts with certainty and the other one says, perhaps, the one that claims for certainty actually gets it. So the moral of the story is, guys, you've got to actually claim with certainty instead of trying to do the right thing. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I don't know. I've always battled with this. Why, when somebody honestly says they don't know, do they have a stronger legal case than the other one that for sure says he knows it's his and he could be lying? I just don't understand that, guys. I must be honest. It's always something I've battled with. Okay, so the bottom line is the one who claims his claim of certainty takes possession of the offspring. If, however, the one says, I don't know whether she gave birth in my domain, and the other one also says, I don't know. In other words, you've got two honest people here. They divide the value of the offspring. Now, sumchus often dealt with dividing value. Do you get what I'm saying? So if you remember that. So if one says she gives birth in my domain, and the other one also says she gives birth in my domain, in that case, the seller shall swear that she gave birth while still in his domain. In other words, before the transaction occurred, and the offspring is his. So we seem to have a case where you've got two different opinions here. The one opinion is if either one are not sure. If one says, I don't know, and the other one says, I don't know, what they do is they split the dividends of what the calf is worth. Because neither one is sure. So they both have half a claim. When each one is adamant that it occurred during his transactional part of the sale, and therefore he has ownership of the calf. At that case, they can't split because they don't agree. The other one feels like he's losing out on a half when he's definitely sure. So what happens is the seller has to swear that the cow gave birth while still in his domain and the offspring is his. Why? Because the buyer claims that the seller is obligated to transfer him both the mother and the offspring. And the seller admits that he's obligated to transfer the money, not the money, the mother, not the offspring, right? So it's the seller that's made the partial admission. And because he made the partial admission, he's the one that's got to swear in order to exempt himself from the payment of the part that he does not admit. So that's an interesting rule. I didn't know that. Did you know that, guys? I had to look at my notes.
No, but it also looks like they take the side of, which makes sense, more of the seller in that particular case when they both in this example.
So no,
they seem to they're favoring the seller because the seller is more trustworthy than the buyer because the buyer can make stuff up. So can the seller, but
well, it's not quite like that. I just want to tell you why, Gav, because not in a case where they're both unsure, because then they divide the value.
No, I'm talking about when they're both sure.
Okay,
that's the only time.
So when they're both sure, it's actually the seller that still has to give the oath. But we do believe.
Yes, he gives the oath, but then if he's prepared to give the oath, then he gets it.
Yeah, but it's not because we believe the seller more. It's because it's the buyer under normal transaction. If the seller agreed, would get both the calf and the mother. So the seller is reneging on giving the calf. So we don't believe him. unless he takes an oath. And the reason why we believe him when he takes an oath is he's using Hashem's divine name, at which anybody should be scared of. So it's not that we believe the seller, because if we believed the seller, he wouldn't have to take an oath. Any
No,
party,
but we're not giving the buyer an opportunity to take an oath as well, to say that that the thing became pregnant or whatever, gave birth while he was the owner.
but
We're only
then
giving
it's
the one the
biased
opportunity.
towards the buyer, not towards the seller. It's opposite. Because we believe because we believe the buyer, unless the seller is prepared to take an oath to the contrary.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the two sides. I understand that. I'm just looking at it from a slightly different angle. I get it. Thank you.
No, explain it to me from your angle. I'm all ears.
No. It's you're 100% right. I'm just saying that the seller, if he's a crook, and he's prepared to take an oath, he's going to get the animal regardless.
Yeah, he will. He won't get Olam Haba, but
I'm just saying, if he's an honest guy, then it does obviously benefit the buyer. But if he's a crook, then it benefits the seller because you can take advantage of that loophole.
Again, firstly, the overlying principle Rabbi Khan told all of us is that Hashem works out finances. The seller's car will die, or his house will burn down, or there'll be some way, and the buyer will come into an extra client that he never was owing. It'll all work itself out. It just has to have the appearance of an unfairness in order to give somebody free choice of acting immorally. So it works out what a person is meant to earn in Rosh Hashanah, they do. But here the trust is to the buyer, and the seller has to prove his innocence by taking an oath. Because he's the one that's reneging on the deal. He's the one that had the exchange of the one animal for the other and all its byproducts. He's just claiming that byproduct occurred of the calf giving birth separate before the sale, and therefore he's reneging on that part, and it wasn't after. So the obligation is on him to clear his name.
Sorry, I didn't pick up that, renege. You actually explained that very well now. Thank you. I'm clear now. I agree with you 100%.
Okay.
The fact is he's reneged on the deal, so the onus is on him to prove he's correct. And
so the Gemara actually says in 96b5, it says it is the seller who swears, because all those who swear under biblical law swear and do not pay. Okay, so it's basically setting a precedent that there are three biblical oaths, guys. There's an oath called a Shavuot Moreh Ketzet, which means it's an oath of partial admission. There's the custodian oath, okay, which is a Shavuot Hashomrim, and then there's an oath to contradict a single witness. So it's a Shavuot Adechad. So there are three oaths. The oath of partial admission, the custodian oath, that's saying that, for example, you're looking after an animal and a wolf came and took the animal to pieces. You have to give an oath that you didn't end up stealing the animal, etc., or not neglecting it. Then there's an oath to contradict a single witness. Because a single witness does count, you don't need two witnesses, but there has to be an oath where you've got a fighting chance. Because it's one person against one person, two against one, two witnesses win. A single witness against a single defendant, the defendant has to be charged with swearing, so as to exempt himself from paying. He's on the defense, right? So the Torah doesn't require, guys, a plaintiff to swear as a prerequisite for collecting. It's not the plaintiff that has to swear. Why? How do we know this? In Shavuos 44b, it states in Exodus in Shemot chapter 22, verse 10.
I was going to ask you, is that okay with you? I'll have it tomorrow. I actually got paid, but it hasn't come through yet. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks, good. Appreciate it. All right, cool. Sorry. Thanks, Dan.
No problem. Gav, did you get the three oaths?
No, I just got the first one, and then I had to call.
Okay, so bottom line, there's a partial admission oath. There's a custodian's oath. We went through that before. If you're looking after an animal and suddenly it disappears, you have to give an oath. The other one is to contradict a single witness. Because if you're fighting with somebody else and they said you're accusing you of a crime, but there's one person, it's one against one. So you have to take an oath you never did it. And most people fold if they're lying against using Hashem's name. So it's the defendant that has to take the oath. Okay? It's not the plaintiff. The Torah doesn't require plaintiff to swear as a prerequisite for collecting at all. Okay? Now, the plaintiff does, however, have to bring evidence, because we learned a rule: if you're trying to extract money from your fellow, you're the one that has to bring the evidence that your fellow hit you with the car. But at that point, the defendant has to swear that it was not true. Or he needs witnesses or some form of evidence. How do we know this? Shmot, Exodus chapter 22, verse 10. The oath of Hashem shall be between the two of them, that he did not extend his hand into his fellow's property, and the owner shall accept it, and he shall not pay. Shall accept actually the other person's oath, and he should not pay. So it says in the Chumash that it's the one sued for payment who must swear in order to exempt himself from paying. So again, there's two rules that seem contradictory, but they're not. The one rule is that the onus is on you who's trying to extract money from your fellow to bring evidence. And then it is basically the plaintiff who must swear. Well, the defendant has to swear that he wasn't in that particular circumstance, otherwise he has to pay. Now, today, that doesn't count because people aren't scared of taking false oaths. We're talking at a time when people had more awe and understanding of who Hashem was. So, guys, in this case, the verse specifically concerns the custodian oath, if you look in the Chumash, but the Gemara extends the law to these two other biblical oaths as well. Okay? Very straightforward. So, but the sages say, we do not swear with regards to slaves nor with regard to land. So what does that mean? So the sages counter that a slave is the same law as land. And accordingly, just as the defendant is not required to swear with respect to a claim regarding land, so too is not required to swear with respect to a claim regarding slaves. So that's in Bava Kamma 100b. So guys, the sages hold that the seller swears to exempt himself only in a case of a calf, which is movable property. That's where we got to. Okay? But with regard to the slave child, the seller isn't required to swear, and the slave child remains in the possession until the buyer brings proof to support his claim that the birth occurred after the sale. At any rate, if it's evident from this brisa and the sages who hold that a slave is treated like land, and it's not Rabbi Meir, that's what the two brisas have come to say. So the one is with respect to the laws of robbery, and the one is with respect to the law of oaths, that you stole a slave and it aged, or you stole an animal and it aged. So these are two evidences proving, according to this case, that the sages say that the slaves are treated as land, and Rabbi Meir says movable property, whereas the first opinion, not with Rav, but the first opinion is that Rabbi Meir said that slaves are treated as land. But in this opinion, with this Bryce and the last, it's saying that according to the sages, slaves are treated as land. And that's why it's the majority opinion, and he's not suiting a minor opinion of one sage as opposed to the rest. Even though Rabbi Meir is great, you still had all his colleagues that said not like him. So we have to generally go with the majority if it's the general Tanai consensus. Okay? So all this is trying to do is prove a case where this brisa, like the last one, is proving that slaves are treated as land according to the sages, whereas the Mishnah itself treats a slave as land, but according to Rabbi Meir. You get what I'm saying? Guys, do you get what I'm saying or not?
Yeah. Yeah.
We're saying, how is it that you could pick up a minor opinion? When we say minor, not that he's not a lightweight. Rabbi Meir is a gadol. He was the leader of the generation. The thing of it is, we're saying is that you've got people of equal stature. Of the majority of opinion, we go with that. So we say, if the Mishnah, why would we go with the opinion of the Mishnah when the other version of the Mishnah is different? And how do you have the right to change a Mishnah? So the one is saying, well, they had a tradition to learn the Mishnah differently. And the other opinion is, if you've got two brises, they outweigh a Mishnah. where a Mishnah gets amended accordingly, if the two brises contradict. But a Mishnah and a brisa, a Mishnah trumps. So the two brises are saying that the rabbis treat a slave as land, and therefore there's no oath, because what did you steal? It's land, you can't steal it. Whereas the other opinion is that it's saying that Rabbi Meir is saying that slaves are like land. So there's no case of robbery, because you can't steal something if it aged under you. What did you steal? It's immovable. It's not like property, it's land. And therefore you only pay for a cow that you stole that age, but not a slave if it's treated as land. If it's treated as immovable, you pay at the time of the robbery because of the deterioration. So that's what we're saying, guys. This was all evidence for that. I'm just bringing the greater context. Okay, so the Gemara basically asks, if so, that Rav reverses the opinion stated in the Mishnah, then this statement of his, that the halacha accords with Rabbi Meir, is incorrect. So Rav should have said then that the halacha accords with the rabbis. So the Gemara answers, this is what Rav is actually saying. According to you, who interchange the possessions of Rabbi Meir and the rabbis when you teach the Mishnah text, the halacha accords to Rabbi Meir. So it's saying, listen, if you attribute the fact that slaves are considered like land, and you say that's Rabbi Meir, good for you. If you say it's the sages, and slaves are like land, good for you. But either way, you don't pay for the deterioration of a slave, because just like you can't steal land, you can't really steal a slave. So if there's deterioration from the time of the robbery, you haven't taken anything. It's only an animal, if you take that it deteriorates, that you provide restitution for the previous higher rate before the animal deteriorated and aged. And that time period is at the time when you took it, not the time of the trial, which could be a year or two later. So, Gemara says, but did Rav say indeed that a slave is regarded as land and cannot be stolen? The issue is, it says, why Rav Daniel Bar Katina said in the name of Rav, one who seizes the slave of his fellow and has the slave do work for him is not liable to pay the master for his use of the slave. Okay, so now we're hitting a different topic. Kevin, do you want to repeat that last statement, or can I repeat that last one?
Yeah, repeat it.
Okay. Rav Daniel Bar Katina said in the name of Rav, one who seizes the slave of his fellow and has the slave do work for him is not liable to pay the master for his use of the slave. And if it should enter your mind that a slave is regarded as land and cannot be legally stolen, why is he not liable to pay for the use of his slave, while the slave stands in possession of his master? So all it's saying there, guys, is if a slave is regarded as movable, which can't be stolen, it's understandable why the robber doesn't need to pay for work, okay? Because, okay, let me just put it in a simple way. If it's movable, then we learned the halacha. What did we learn? Is that, what does a robber have to do? Guys, he only has to return the stolen article itself, or its cash value at the time of the robbery, if the article is no longer in existence. There's no penalties. We learned if you stole a cow and you get it to graze your land and work your land, providing it didn't deteriorate, if you robbed a person of their cow, you just have to return their cow. You just have to return what you stole if you're a robber. Not a thief where you pay double or fourfold or fivefold if you sell it or slaughter it. But let's just say for robbery, you just replace the article with cash if you don't have it, or you return the cow. If it's deemed as immovable, and you steal it and you work the animal, in that case, you just return the animal. So the same thing with the slave. If it's deemed as a movable, all you do if you work the slave is you have to return the slave. There's no penalty for getting it to work. But if a slave is seen as land, you have to pay. Kevin, why do you think you'd have to pay?
If the slave, because it's if the slave was stolen, you say.
If the slave, because you told me last night you did some chazorah. So if the slave is seen as land, why would you have to pay for the use of the slave if it's seen as land compared to being treated as a movable?
Because the it has value, And
Land
it
value
usually
for
works
what?
the owner, it belongs to the owner, and the
No.
owner gets value from it.
No. Okay, so there are two different definitions. In law, if you steal my cell phone, that's a bad example. If you steal my horse and you ride the horse all day from Joburg to Durban, and you make the horse a bit tired, but you got a free ride for the day, okay? And you didn't have to hire transport. Then all you have to do is return my horse. You don't have to pay for the benefit you got of its services if it's treated as a movable. You just have to either give the cash value if you killed the horse on the trip from sheer exhaustion, or you just have to return a tired horse if you rob me of it. That's all you have to do. You just have to make good on what you stole. That's it. But if it's treated as, that's if it's a movable, if it's treated as land, you can't stay in my property rent-free. If you're getting benefit as a tenant, and I could have rented out that space to somebody else, even though you don't own it and it's land and you can't own it, you still have to pay for the use of it as a tenant. So that's why in this particular case, it's a contradiction to the Gemara. Because if you're saying, according to Rav Daniel Bar Katina, who said in the name of Rav, if you seize a slave and you get it to work and you don't have to pay for it, well then how can he turn around, Rav, and say, oh, it's treated as land? It's treated as a movable. If it's treated as land and you basically using somebody's land, then you have to pay rent. That's the argument against Rav. You get it? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, we've lost Arthur. Sorry, we have lost Arthur.
Do you see what I'm saying, Kevin, in terms of the nuance? You see, I want to go faster and I'm ready to go on. But if everybody's battling with the concepts, that's where the difficulty of progressing fast is, Kevin. That's
the slave is considered, it's considered like land which is immovable.
No. Yeah,
So,
it is. But what I'm saying is the argument here is Rav said somewhere else. Okay? Rav Daniel Bar Katina said in the name of Rav, somewhere else. He said, if you seize a slave and get it to do work, you don't owe the owner of the slave. Which means a slave then is treated as a movable. Because if you borrow my article like a cow, it's treated as a movable asset, and you get it to work for you, and you rob me of it, you just have to return the cow. If you killed it from hard work, you have to give me the cash. You don't have to pay for the labor of the cow, because that's how we treat a returning of movable assets. Land is not a movable asset. And since there's no money paid for working a slave that you kidnap of somebody else, in that particular case, it's treated as a movable by law, not as land. So we've learned here that Rav said that a slave is treated as land, which means if it's aged, the robber doesn't pay for the aging and of what the slave was previously at the time of the robbery and keeps the slave that's permanently aged. Do you get what I'm saying? He keeps it because there's a physical change, a deterioration. And if there's a physical change and a deterioration, then in that particular case, the robber would keep the deteriorated animal, whatever the case may be, or the slave, and then give the owner the value at the time of the original robbery, because it's a higher value. That physical aging process is a permanent change, and therefore under biblical law, it's not reversible. He doesn't hand it back to the original owner. He doesn't hand it back at all. He has to keep it and give the original owner the higher value of the slave, unless you treat slave like land, which can't technically be stolen. But therefore, we make him pay for the cow that aged, but not the slave, because the reason why we don't make him pay for the slave is it's treated as land. But here there's an argument against the slave being treated as land, because if you kidnap a slave and get it to work for you, you only have to return the slave to the original owner, which means it's treated as movable property. Because if you steal land, in the sense that you reside on it without paying rent, you owe the rent, even if you don't take ownership of the land. That's the contradiction here. So we're saying it's a proof against Rav that somewhere else he treats a slave as movables, and here he's saying slaves are like land, which means you can return an aged slave without having to acquire the slave from the deterioration and pay the higher value at the time of the robbery. That's all we're saying. That's it. So what I'm saying, guys, is I generally want to go faster, but it's throttled by what people can understand.
So I think the speed you did tonight is perfect, and I think it's the repetition. Remember what we discussed. If you leave the repetition out, only absolutely where necessary. If you just minimize, like today you just started, it saves a lot of time. So don't speed up the actual new content. Just reduce the repetition. That's all. Not completely eliminate.
Yeah,
that's what we said we're going to try that. Let's give that a shot. So don't actually speed up the pace and start talking faster, because we're not going to grasp. I can see you are, but I have to really focus. I'm saying that's not entirely necessary. What's necessary is don't repeat. If we sloughed and we missed, then that's it. We have to just move on, because you'll kind of pick it up. If the person's completely lost, then it's different, But
you see,
just to reduce the repetition, not necessarily speed things up.
Just one thing, Kevin, is that at the end of the day, the best way that I learned Gemara is it's not about memory. Edwin Selp's brother once articulated it at Sukkot once. He said that when you understand what you've learned, you can easily give it over, because once you've understood it, you can teach it. That's why you're so good at teaching English, because you understand the concepts of the lesson, the structure, the grammar, the correct, appropriate application of language, etc. So it's the same with Gemara. Once I've understood all the concepts, it's easy to give it over. Am I making sense?
So the slave, just one question of the slave. Okay, so the guy uses the slave without permission. As long as he returns it, there's no problem. But the slave could get an injury, could...
say you kill the slave from overwork. Then if it's treated as a movable, you just give the cash equivalent of the slave's a bad example, because you could be liable for the death penalty. So that's a bit of a difficult one. But if you cause permanent disability to the slave, and you have to make restitution to the owner, then I suppose you keep the crippled slave, and then you pay the full value of the slave pre-injury. That's exactly what we're saying. But that's only if a slave is treated as a movable. If it's treated as land, what have you stolen? That's the whole issue. And
so it's basically treated as movable, then it's considered like an animal.
Rav before turned around and said a slave is seen as land, and now this is a proof that he's treating him as a movable, because you don't owe the original owner if you work the slave. That's a contradiction.
Because it can't move. It's like that. If it's like part of it's like land doesn't move.
No, slave can move. It's just it can't change acquisition or applications. It's not because he's a quadriplegic. It's just whether it's a fixed asset or movable asset in terms of restitution. Now, where the heck is Arthur gone? And I'm going to phone him to say, how the heck can we just bail?
Well, maybe less than a minute.
His time zone. He's on a different time zone. So
Jupiter, just give